Hello and welcome to another motorcycling video. I'm out on the road and I'm going to talk to you about ANCAP for a little while. I'm prompted to do this because of an article I read in the drive section of the Channel 9 newspapers. The article was written by a man called Sam Purcell, who posits himself as the off-road editor. I should say at the beginning, I don't think that I am stealing his copy or voiding his copyright or anything like that, because I'm working on the assumption that many people who watch my content don't read newspapers, and we're not able to read this article because it's subscription only, and therefore I think it's in the public interest that I talk about the issues that he raised in his article and provide some commentary on them. Now, before I get into it, I'd like to start with the question of where do you place safety when you're thinking about buying a new car? I suspect that financial decisions are probably the biggest ones, but whereabouts does safety sit in the grand scheme of things? Now, in talking about this issue and talking about what ANCAP does, let me be absolutely clear. I am not calling for the end of ANCAP testing, and I'm not calling for the end of funding for ANCAP. I'm simply raising some issues that impact on consumers as a result of the work that ANCAP does and the recommendations and decisions that it makes, and just raising those issues for discussion. Now, a few acronyms that I probably should explain first of all. Up until 2015, we had what were called the Australian Design Rules. They were promulgated, I think, in 1999, or the last version of them was promulgated in 1999 and existed till 2015. Those were the technical and mechanical specifications and so on that told vehicle manufacturers what their cars had to be like in order to be able to be sold in Australia. They've since been replaced by what are now called the Australian Light Vehicle Standard Rules, or ALVSRs. Light vehicles being those passenger vehicles that you and I drive, the ones that are in our driveways and we see in our car parks and so on. Remember that large SUVs and 4x4 dual cab utes are no longer classified as light passenger vehicles but rather light commercial vehicles. And remember also that the new vehicle emission standards have come into effect, and they probably come under the banner of these ALVSRs. Under a process called homologation, which is a mouthful of a word to get around, but what it means is that manufacturers can have a certainty that if they make a car, it can be sold in multiple markets. In other words, a Camry is a Camry wherever it's sold. There's not an Australian version and a UK version and a European version and so on. It may be that some models are only available in some markets, or it may be that some manufacturers don't offer vehicles in some markets. But essentially, if you build, let's say, for illustrative purposes, a Kia Carnival, you can sell it in multiple markets, and that gives the manufacturers a degree of certainty about what it is that their vehicles have to be like in order to be sold. The major difference, of course, being the decision about whether the steering wheel goes on the right or left of the vehicle. Now, ANCAP is a separate organisation altogether. ANCAP stands for Australian New Car Assessment Program. It is a body funded by the government, but is not a government body. In other words, it gets its money from the government, but it's not part of the public service and doesn't necessarily answer to the government. And what it does is that it assesses new cars for their safety and crashworthiness and gives them a rating out of 5 and a number of stars. And so you would be correct in assuming that 5 stars is the highest safety rating, and it, the safety diminishes with the decreasing number of stars. But it is possible to sell a car in Australia that has 0 star rating under ANCAP because it meets those ALVSRs that I mentioned earlier. And there was a case of one MG model and also a Mahindra that were given 0 stars by ANCAP but still could legally be sold here. Obviously, for manufacturers, a 5-star safety rating is a good selling point, but manufacturers are not required. It's not mandatory that you submit your vehicles for assessment and testing, and ANCAP has no regulatory function. In other words, you can just say, we tested this car and we gave it this number of stars, and beyond that the car is either sold in Australia because it meets those ALVSRs that I mentioned, or it doesn't meet those rules. Now, as a result of ANCAP's decisions, some things have been happening in our market. First of all, one of the very big things is that cars are becoming more expensive. And Mr. Purcell in his article gave the example of a Toyota Yaris hatch that used to be somewhere between, in 2020 was around $15,000. Now, with an increase, with a new model and lots more safety, it is $9,000 more. Now, bear in mind, of course, that Toyota have made a decision that all vehicles now sold in Australia, I think with the exception of the Hilux, will all be hybrid. And of course, some of that increase could be put down to inflation and increased labour costs, increased material costs, increased transportation costs and so on. But $9,000 is a big increase on a $15,000 car. And there are now almost no sub $20,000 cars in Australia because manufacturers say we can't make those cars at that price for what ANCAP wants us to put on them. What ANCAP does is it assesses the car for front end collision, side collision, rear collision, and then it also assesses the safety of the occupants in the front seat, in the second seat and the third seat if that's appropriate, and then it looks at the suite of ADAS. I should have explained that earlier. ADAS stands for Advanced Driver Assistance Systems. So things like rear pedestrian alert, lane keeper assist, speed side recognition, and all that other stuff that's now in cars and is operated through an infotainment screen, are all part of what ANCAP uses to determine whether or not your vehicle gets 5 stars. More of that you have, the more stars you're likely to get. The lesser amount of that you have, the lesser number of stars you are going to have. Now, one of the concerns is that despite all of these new ADAS additions to cars, the road toll is the highest in 2023 that it's been since 2012. So in almost 12 years, when lots of infotainment screens and all these safety systems have been added to cars, and there have been increased fines, there have been increased police patrols, roadside breath testing, roadside drug testing, phone cameras, speed cameras, seatbelt cameras and so forth, the road toll is still rising. And there could be any number of reasons for that, but ANCAP are of the idea that there need to be more safety systems. So going back to the increase in prices of cars, for example, the Isuzu D-Max in the 2019 model, the LST, was $54.8K, that's $54,800. The 2020 model with the X-Terrain is now $62,900. That is again because of increases in the safety equipment that manufacturers are required to put into their vehicles. An MG3, for example, has had an increase of $7,000 over the previous model, and the base model, which was once $20,000, is now $23,000. So cars are becoming more expensive, and the manufacturers are saying, well, in order for us to get a 5-star rating, we've got to put all this ADAS stuff in our cars. To do that costs us thousands of dollars. Ultimately, the consumer pays for that. Now, that is not to suggest that those things should not be in cars or that ANCAP should not ask for them if they are in fact safety measures, but it's a fact to say that the price increases are ultimately passed on to the consumer, that when you're buying a new car. The second thing that's happening as a result of that is that because cars are more expensive, it means they're more expensive to insure. Now, clearly, if you buy a $60,000 car, it's going to cost you more to insure than if you buy a $20,000 car, regardless of your driving record, simply because the $20,000 car is less to replace if it's written off than the $60,000 car. But on top of that, not only is the insurance more expensive, but the repair costs are becoming more expensive, simply because all of these ADAS additions to the car operate on sensors, and those sensors are usually in the front bumpers or the rear bumpers, or in some cases the windscreen. And so in the previous time, before we had all this ADAS stuff on our cars, the bumper could be replaced, the panels could be beaten out or replaced and spray painted, and your car looked as good as new again and you drove away. But now there are all these sensors, and the sensors need to be sometimes replaced or check that their positioning was as it was before. They need to be recalibrated, and the technical skills required to do all that are much more complex. It takes more time to do that, and therefore repairs are becoming more expensive. Even a humble windscreen has become a more expensive item to replace. There's a story about a woman who had a Subaru that got a crack in the windscreen. O'Brien Glass said they couldn't replace one of their screens, and you had to get a genuine Subaru windscreen because it had a camera built into the windscreen. Subaru quoted the woman $10,000 for the replacement screen. Now, ultimately, the insurance company decided they weren't going to pay the $10,000, and the car was written off. So, if your car is then written off, especially in New South Wales, if it becomes a repairable write-off, it cannot be re-registered in New South Wales. So somebody can buy it and take it interstate and repair it and register it interstate, but it cannot be registered in New South Wales again. So that vehicle then either becomes parts or scrap. So consider all the materials, all the energy and all the costs that went into building that car and making that car. Let's supposing you have an accident within the first year of the life of that car, you get the insurance payout, which is either the agreed value or the market value, but then the car is written off, and all of those resources and energy and so on that might have been amortised over the 5 or 6 years or however long you kept that car are now lost because the car's been written off. So that's the second thing that's happening as a result. A third thing that's happening is that smaller cars are going out of fashion. You don't see very many small hatches. A hot hatch, as it used to be called, was a popular thing, but now you don't see very many. You see small, medium, large size SUVs. You see lots of 4x4 dual cab utes. In fact, 56% of our sales are large SUVs and dual cab utes. But small cars, little hatches, are a thing of the past, and that is because, for two reasons. First of all, because people want more safety equipment put in their cars, and so the manufacturers say, well, we can't make a car for $20,000. We can't make a small hatch anymore. We have to make a bigger car. But also because a car is bigger, there is a greater surface area over which to spread the impact, and therefore, when there is a collision, the damage is spread over a wider footprint of the car, if you like, than if it were a small car. Now, following on from that, since we're getting less and less small cars and less small hatches and fewer sub $20,000 cars and so on, not only are cars becoming bigger, not only are they becoming more expensive and more expensive to reinsure, but they are becoming heavier. All of this ADAS stuff requires a thicker wiring loom than might have been existed before, but also in order to meet front, side and rear collision standards, in other words, to keep the cabin or the passenger capsule, if you want to use it that way, in order to keep that safe and keep the passengers safe, the surrounding superstructure, if you like, has to be stronger and tougher. And that makes the car heavier. Heavier cars, of course, cause more damage when they hit lighter cars and smaller cars. Now, we'll know it's that they were not making many small cars anymore, but there still are small cars on the road. So heavier cars cause more damage when they're in a crash. But there's also another downside to that. A heavier car, simply by definition, uses more fuel because it takes more energy just to keep the car moving than it does to use a smaller car. Now, to give an example of that, in 1990, Toyota Corolla CSX Seeker with auto was 1,070 kilograms, so a bit over 1 tonne. The 2024 Corolla Accent Sport Hybrid is 1,400 kilograms. So it's almost a half a tonne more. And that means that despite improvements in fuel efficiency that might have come from cleaner engines and more efficient engines and greener fuel and cleaner burning fuel and so on, that you are making more trips to the fuel petrol station because your car is heavier and requires more energy just to keep it moving and uses more fuel. Now, as a result of ANCAP's decisions, and their biggest decision is to say, well, if you don't have what we consider to be a reasonable suite of ADAS additions to your vehicle, we will give you a less than 5-star rating. Now, there are motoring journalists who say, well, 3 or 4-star rating is still a pretty safe car. But obviously, from a marketing point of view and from a personal point of view, when you look at a car and you see 5 stars, you assume it is safer, and it's correct to assume that. You assume that it's safer than a car that's got 3 or 4 stars. And remember that a vehicle that got 5 stars a couple of years ago might not get those 5 stars now because it doesn't have all of those ADAS features that are now required as standard. The standard that ANCAP work by is been in existence over the years from 2023 to 2025. New standards will come into effect in 2026. The manufacturers would be aware of those standards and must be now working towards making vehicles that will meet those ANCAP standards in order to get the 5-star rating. Some manufacturers have models which they say they would be prepared to sell in Australia under certain conditions, and a very good example of that is the Mitsubishi EKX EV. It is what one motoring reviewer that I saw referred to as an errand car. In other words, you get in the car and you run your errands. You go down the shop and buy some bread and milk. You pick up 1 or 2 kids from school. You take someone to ballet or something like that. You don't buy this little EV with the idea that you're going to do a road trip or that you're going to drive from Sydney to Melbourne. You buy it with the idea that you're going to use it to run around town and do lots of little errands and messages like that. And Mitsubishi say, yes, they could sell that car in Australia at $25,000, and that would be drive-away price probably, and it would be by far the cheapest EV available in Australia. The problem is that as it's currently configured, it would only earn 3 stars from ANCAP. Now Mitsubishi say, well, if we wanted to sell that car and get a 5-star rating for it, we would probably have to charge $30,000 or more. And we know that at that price it simply won't sell because there are other options that people look and say, well, I'm not going to pay $30,000 for a car that only seats 4 and has a range of maybe 100 or 200 kilometres at the most, when I can get an MG or an Aura or something like that has a much bigger range, has much bigger passenger capacity and has even bigger luggage space. So Mitsubishi have made a decision to say, well, we're not going to make that model available to the Australian market because we simply can't sell it at the price that we want to sell it to make it make sales reasonable. And if we do what ANCAP want us to do, we won't be able to sell any of them. The problem with the ANCAP rating system is, as I said, that it can be confusing in that you assume that if you've got 5 stars, it is a safe car, and that's a reasonable assumption. You therefore assume that if it's 4 or 3 stars or something like that it's a less than safe car. What it means in some cases is it may not have the full suite of ADAS things. It may have decided to delete 1 or 2 of those features, where ANCAP says you should have one of those, you need to have one of those, and you don't have one of those, so we're not going to give you 5 stars. The manufacturer says, well, we're prepared to forego that on this vehicle, or if someone wants those things, they'll pay for they won't pay for the base model, they'll pay for the middle of the range or the top spec range. But we will sell this vehicle as it is, or we will attempt to sell this vehicle as it is. As I said, a vehicle that might have earned 5 stars under the current set of protocols from 23 to 25 might not earn those 5 stars under the new protocols that come in 2026. My car, for example, which is a 2010 Toyota Camry, I consider it to be a very safe car. I'm very happy with it. Safety and comfort are important to me. I don't need to know too much about kilowatts and newton meters and all that sort of stuff. I just need to know the vehicle's going to get me from A to B and I'm going to arrive there safely. But I suspect if somebody looked at it today and said, we're going to give it as 5-star, we're going to give it an ANCAP rating, it probably would get no stars because it has no ADAS features. It has no speed camera alert or speed sign alert. It has no lane keeping. It has no rear pedestrian alert. It has no cyclist alert. It does not have adaptive cruise control and all those sort of things. So those are issues that need to be considered. Now, one of the questions that Sam Purcell raised in his article is there a point, or will we reach a point where the added safety features that ANCAP say are required doesn't necessarily produce any tangible outcome for the consumer. In other words, you can add more and more electronic safety systems, but ultimately the consumer gains no benefit from those things because either they don't use them, or they turn them off, or they're not aware that they're there, or the situations that they are in doesn't give rise to the necessity to use those systems. But nevertheless, the vehicle manufacturer is required to put them in there in order to put them on the vehicle in order to get the 5-star rating. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, I am not advocating for the end of ANCAP testing. In fact, I think the more information that consumers have about the cars they're going to buy in terms of safety and in terms of emissions and anything else that they need to know about it, the more informed they are, the better decisions they can make. But we do need to be aware that all of those decisions about safety features and so forth that ANCAP say need to be in cars have a cost, and ultimately you as the consumer are the person who pays that cost. The manufacturer is simply going to say, well, if I've got to put one of these and one of these and one of these in the car, and that's going to cost me an extra $10,000 for that car, I'm just going to pass the extra $10,000 on to the consumer. And the consumer then has the choice to say, well, I'm not going to pay the extra $10,000, I'm not going to buy that car, I'll buy a cheaper model, or I'll buy a different brand or whatever. Or if that's the case with all manufacturers, which it will be, then I'll just have to pay that because that's the cost. Well, those are my thoughts about ANCAP and costing consumers money. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts, add them in the comments. Hope you either enjoyed the commentary or the scenery, and I'll catch you in the next video.